Today we are finally exploring the numerous unused early and test maps found left over in Poppy Playtime Chapter 5. More than I think I've ever covered for any game on this series. Let's check them out. Alright, so starting things off here, we have a map titled Blackout Demo, which is exactly what it says it is, an early blockout map of the Dollhouse Blackout section. Yeah, a blackout blockout. For those that don't know, blockout maps are essentially rough drafts of a map built using basic shapes and colors and stuff as placeholders. Now this map leads us into the Dollhouse basement, where immediately we can see various basic blockout objects, including some shelves, tables. There's an early version of the power switch to the power panel, though the panel itself isn't added here yet. And there's even an early version of the incinerator things, or whatever they're supposed to be in this room, which are just recesses in the wall here. The rooms for the puzzle you need to do here to free Poppy and Kissy in the final cut of this area are here, though they're missing basically every interactable object that you actually use for the puzzle itself. And really, all that's here is an early placeholder for the panel that you swap between the fire and ice elements, as well as this exit vent that just has a Dog Day toy here as it's seen in the final vent, but here just lacking the Poppy goo. And speaking of Poppy, she and a hairless Kissy are here as well, and Poppy's model actually looks a bit different as the coloring of her dress is off, and here she has all of these like dots on her face. Now I was curious, so I checked out the raw model for her, and it turns out that these irregularities stem from the textures being incorrectly applied here, as her dress seems to be using textures from her head in her damaged state, and these dots are normally supposed to be on the back of her head, so don't know why this happened, but either way, it looks pretty strange. And if you were wondering what the jail cell looks like here in this map, it's just completely empty. And this basement is just the start, as there's lots more to go for this map. Going up the stairs actually still triggers the blackout section, where of course, the lights go completely dark, but thankfully we still have the flashlight, or I can just disable lighting to get a better view of everything around us. Going upstairs, we can actually find some of Lily Longbraid's UV hair path, some of the art text, as well as these blockout models of the globy pens, which I thought looked amazing. Oh, and Kissy and Poppy follow us by kinda just teleporting around as well, which is kinda creepy. Now what's also interesting here is that this area actually has dialogue triggers that cause some audio to play. And these clips are actually the early Poppy and Lily voice lines, which I covered in my last video. Triggering the blackout will cause Poppy to say,
"What's going on?"
Going up the stairs, we can hear Lily's early All Your Fault recording, as well as something shattering.
All your fault.
Going into this very empty kitchen area, Poppy will try to guide you back on path and say,
"I think it's this way."
Then going into the next room, we'll have Lily start humming her early Itsy Bitsy Spider track, as we can also see what looks like the same UV art that's normally hidden in the final version of this room. And then getting to this door, we'll have Poppy and Kissy warping right to it, and a huggy laugh sound effect plays. There's also this perfectly drawn star UV light art here that isn't seen in the final game, and I guess this is supposed to signify the start of the Lily Blackout chase, as soon as we go through this door, it just starts up and works just the way it does in the final game. Along the path, we can see several otherwise unused models that I've covered in my previous videos, including the early braid lock model on the front door, the chairs and table here, the early blockout slide model, as well as Lily's path is also a bit different here too, as it loops around the pillar here, which it doesn't in the final version. Then in addition to the star graphic earlier, there's also the crudely drawn skull UV light graphic that I covered in previous videos too. Here, apparently signifying to not go there, as Lily apparently treats this as cheating and will insta-delete you if you try to go that way. We eventually get to the second floor music room where she teleports to, and unfortunately, in the state that this map is left in, this section seems to be unbeatable, as she will literally warp into the only path that she allows you to take, and even trying to get around her will just get you jump scared, so yeah, I don't think you can normally clear this part. But thankfully, with the power of hacking this game, we can bypass Lily's no cheating policy and move on to the next area, where we can see a basic setup for the power lever here. And in the closet in this room, we can find a placeholder model for the music sheet collectible, where we can also see, I guess, an early note pattern for the piano. And similarly, in the next room, we can find this placeholder note here. And for both of these, I thought it was pretty funny that they just have text right on them in the default Unreal Engine font like this. This hallway also has another trigger for yet another early Poppy line.
Up here.
And after zipping up, interestingly, we get a final Lily line.
No! You can't leave! The party hasn't even started!
Followed by some early Poppy and Lily lines after, as the early Mini Mega Braids model spawns in the room behind us here. And level end text also pops up, signifying the end of the test of this Blackout section.
We found a way out. Hurry.
Bad toy box. She's a bad toy.
But that's not all for the dollhouse, as there are of course several areas that aren't normally on Lily's path that we can still check out, including the garage area, where we have this hilarious looking blockout model of the car and battery. There's an early idea for the wall that rotates down in here. The backrooms lab, or whatever you want to call it, is here too in a very basic state. Then upstairs we can find the bathroom with this shower. Lily's room is mostly empty, but it was cool to see these purple frame things, I guess indicating that they were meant for pictures of Lily. And what's pretty wild is that although it doesn't look like you can get into this room normally without using hacks, the room that you can open after returning Lily's book back to the bookcase just has this massive box thing in the middle of the room that's like half textured with the blue Grabpack hands texture, and then the bottom half here has the PJ Pugapillar and Baby Longlegs texture that's used on the balloons throughout this chapter. Now at first I had no idea what this thing was supposed to be. That is until I looked at this side of it, which has this large crank. So this actually appears to be an early iteration of what eventually became Lily's gramophone that's seen in the main dining hall. Although this doesn't confirm it, I'd like to believe that the original idea for the gramophone was for it to be comically large like it is here. Also, with normal lighting, the dollhouse actually looks really cool here. Like, the light coming in through the big window in the main dining hall makes this look amazing. It's like a liminal fever dream. I'd honestly love to play an entire game that just looks like this. Anyways, in addition to all of the rooms we've already checked out, there's actually a few unused ones here that I don't believe made it into the final version of this map. Just behind the dining hall, it looks like there was supposed to be a door on the right side here, as it leads to this long hallway that just has Lily chilling in the middle of it, but it kinda just leads to nothing. Then in the vents that you take to escape Lily's room, there's another room where you can drop down into here, and this seems pretty intentional, so perhaps this would have been a secret room for another collectible or something. But in the final version, this path in the vents just gets blocked off. And then lastly, there's like a whole section that seems like an alternate way to escape the dollhouse, as beyond the one vent that you go through near the basement jail room, there is another vent that could have been taken with the blockout vent covering here, and then this leads to a pretty long hallway that at the end has this red door. Now, it's unfortunately not 100% clear what this area could have been for, but I don't think it makes sense for this to have been a scrapped entrance. So I think signs are pointing to this perhaps once being a planned alternate method of escaping the dollhouse. Now that's about all there is inside the dollhouse here, but we also got a few interesting things outside of it too. Starting with several of the early Lily models referenced as mini Mega Braids. There's one under the main dining room floor, and then 3 of them behind the backroom section, with one upside down for some reason, by the basement escape red door that we just went over. What's also interesting about the middle one here is that this model has several of these shapes all over it, which we can see that they glow purple, so this looks like it was a test of some emissive textures for Lily, as we can see these glowing cylinder objects in her hair, on her ankles, on her dress, as well of course in her eyes and mouth. And I can't decide if this looks more creepy with the lighting disabled or enabled like this. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And then finally, last up for this first map, when enabling the debug view that we checked out in my first video on this chapter, found way under the floor is a whole series of placeholders for the UV light art, kinda just all over the place. And it's not just the placeholder floating dev icons either, as when I actually went down there as the player, I was able to shine Globy's UV light at all of these, and they seem to either be Lily's hair path or arrows. Now, some of the sections don't really seem to have any rhyme or reason to them, but I can only assume that all of these here were the result of the devs placing in the UV art as a test of Lily's path for the Blackout segment. In any case, I thought it was really interesting to see the massive collection of all of these things down here, so I figured you might think so too. Before we fully move on to the other maps, there's also a map titled Dollhouse Blockout, and at first I thought maybe this was an early version of the dollhouse after it gets split apart, but it actually just appears to be the same map we just went over, but with like 70% of the objects missing. So yeah, not really anything extra to talk about with this one. That said though, there is actually a blockout map for the escape section, where although it also seems to be missing a bunch of the map's objects, there's still a few to talk about, like this dining room setup, where we can see some dev text for where all of the characters were to be seated during the prototype's intro cutscene. And the seating plan here is like completely different than what ended up being used in the final iteration. Then, in addition to the various objects kinda just floating in the void, we can see the part of the house that the player zips across to during the escape, and then remnants of the music room, the window that you escape the house from, parts of the rooftop, a lone floating blockout cloud platform here, and then the ending section, which to my surprise has the layout pretty much exactly how it's seen in the final version. Now next up, going back a bit in the game's progression, we actually also have an early blockout map for level 6, the testing and conditioning area. Here we actually spawn out of bounds in this map near a large cylinder platform, as well as this dev note just indicating that the player here would get a call from Giblet telling the player what to do next. And yeah, they poke fun at the planned Giblet calls replacing how Ollie would call you in chapters 3 and 4. And well, these calls seem to have been an idea scrapped later in development, as Giblet doesn't call you anytime in Chapter 5 here, and this appears to tie into the seemingly scrapped idea for Globy to have a walkie-talkie function that we discussed in my previous videos. Anyways, going back inbounds, the map looks to have been meant to start at this number 1 node here, and these are found around this area numbered like this, indicating the intended or optimal path that I guess the player was supposed to take. We can also find more dev notes around the area here like we saw back in Chapter 4. And unfortunately, outside of this map, there really weren't any of these left over in the final maps this time around. Getting to the reception area, we can see it was originally planned to be very dark, but the final version of this area has it pretty well lit. And then we can also find this note for the bead puzzle in this room being a nice to have, and it looks like this was meant to have been a means to unlock a thing. The bead puzzle did end up getting added to this room, but moving all of the beads around unfortunately does not seem to unlock a thing, so I guess this idea was cut in favor of it just being an interactable background set piece. Next, we can move on to the observation rooms, where inside we can see most of the objects just being blocks, and there are a few inspirational messages written on the walls in that lovely default Unreal Engine text. A happy smile goes for miles, keep that frown upside down. A happy toy is a good toy, you are never fully dressed without a smile, as well as be the joy the world needs. And I don't think any of these messages got kept for the final version of this map. Anyways, going along the hall here, we can find another dev note indicating that there was supposed to be a jump scare here if the player went up against the glass. And they wanted it to look not goofy, and I guess they weren't able to do that, as the jump scare seems to have gotten scrapped, as nothing really happens in the final version of this area, and with how obvious the lore is through the window here, at least on my first playthrough, I was kind of expecting something to jump out at me. Here though, there actually does seem to be a small test for this jump scare, as going up against the window will cause this Ooga Booga text to pop up, which is definitely real scary. Then interestingly, although most of the objects in this map are just blockout placeholders, there are still some proper models here, like some playground objects, and there are even some functional doors as well. After breaking the glass here, we get to the central room, where we can check out this massive middle set piece which was cut in the final version. And then going to node number 4 here, yeah, for whatever reason, this blockout map has trigger points that will actually force you back into the final version of this area, but also like way out of bounds, which yeah, is super helpful, thank you. So I had to be really careful to avoid these, so I enabled the debug view to help me see these trigger boxes so I could avoid them. Anyways, so bypassing that, we now get to the area where you first unlock the conductive hand, where we can see a very basic setup for the puzzle to do so. But interestingly, although we can still find the battery here and drag it over to unlock the glass door here, the devs actually put the hand itself out of bounds, so without hacking, you can't even grab it normally. And similarly, the ice panel is also moved out of bounds, so I had to move myself on top of the map to even use it to proceed to removing the poppy goo off of the heat panel here, which thankfully this time is actually reachable normally. And with that, we can burn the braid lock here to get to node number 5, which is the power room. But unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a power panel to power up any of these other nodes here in or out of bounds. So I guess the power functionality wasn't finalized here yet. What's also interesting about this room is there's another Ooga Booga text here on this section, which in the final game is oddly the one panel that you can open in this room that doesn't have anything behind it. So I guess maybe a small jump scare was once planned for that too. So with the power being non-functional, we'll have to zip through any of the locked doors that require the hand scanner. And up next, we can check out this early version of Memory Meadow, as well as the memory machine here, which at this point was just a blockout chair and headpiece. And then there are a few more dev notes here discussing plans for how the loading and unloading of this section of the map was going to work. There is also one of the memory drives here, but at this point there's nothing to put it in yet. Then after going back to the central area, we can get to point number 8, which starts up the segment of turning off the red gas to the one room on the second floor. And this section is actually fully functional, as after finding the UV art upstairs for the order of the shapes, there are valves for each one, and after spinning them in the right order, we can pull this lever here to stop the flow, though there wasn't ever any red gas implemented in this room yet, so I don't think you have to do this here, but still, it's cool that it's functional. And I suppose finishing this pops up this dev text here that reads, "You turned off the smoke upstairs, now you won't die." And although the gas puzzle is doable here, blowing up the chemistry room to break the window there to enter the next room isn't, as yet again, the fire panel thing is moved out of bounds here, making it unreachable. But I went ahead and moved the wall back to make it accessible, and with this I could crack the window. And although the opening here isn't actually big enough to fit us in, it seems, I ended up hacking my way into the room to finally get the memory drive. It certainly wouldn't have been possible without hacking, but I'm glad I was still able to brute force my way through most of this. Next up, here we can find a dev note about the one section of the platform that falls as you try to jump over to the collectible tape. Which, fun fact, I was actually able to make the jump on my first playthrough, even though I don't think you're supposed to be able to do so. And now we get to the Lullaby Lane area, where we can see some more inspirational dev text on the walls, early versions of all the conditioning rooms, which here are mostly empty, but one references a fake panel that would have resulted in a mini jump scare, which is something I don't recall being there in the final version. And then another one of these rooms has this dev note that references the need for the hot hand charge to be used for sealing a pipe bursting in front of Amy's office, which A means that this predates the idea of having the braid lock blocking the door, and B that Miss Gracie was seemingly originally once planned to be named Amy instead. And despite there being another note here referring to sealing the pipe to get inside, there is actually a braid lock on the door here, or a door I suppose, as it isn't actually blocking the way to the office at all, and is just chilling here on the side. And then inside the office, we can find another dev note, this time confirming that Miss Gracie was originally named Miss Amy. I think it's pretty wild to see that both Miss Gracie and Lily Lovebraids had their names changed from some original planned ones. Then last up for this area, there's a white number 1 point here, and the dev note beside it refers to this as the Silver Path, I guess denoting optional side areas, and this is for the hallway where you can find the VHS tape if you punch in the face password that you can remember from one of the memory sequences. And here in this map, we still do have the keypad for this, but the rest of this area is unfinished, as beyond this door, although the VHS tape and the TV player combo are there, basically nothing else is. But we do get to see this funky purple corridor with the debug view, which was pretty neat. And speaking of unfinished, way under the map, just like we saw there in the final version of this area, are the memory sequence rooms, where we do have a few objects floating in the void here, but not really much else. Then finally returning back to the memory machine, we have beats 16 and 17 here, with 16 revealing the original plan was for the memory machine to spit out a key card to exit this area, instead of it being a number password that it gives you. Then 17 here adds the possibility of it being a code. And then we get a nice end of level note, as well as another one indicating plans here to add the connecting hallway to the next area. Now I quite enjoyed this part of this chapter, so it was really cool to see this very early iteration of it. And although several things were certainly non-functional, it was neat to see that some things still were. Then after this map are leftovers of some other Blockout maps, but the others are essentially all empty, including a map for the reanimation section, the train ending, and then the Sweet Street Blockout map does still have some objects like some doors, the ice cream truck, as well as this dev message that we saw left over hidden in the final map too, but yeah, for the most part, it's still pretty empty. Also, a bit of an aside before we go on, but some of the test rooms here actually still have autosave triggers, it seems. And I guess since there's no proper map thumbnails for the test maps, they all just default to being either fully white or a glitchy image like this, which I thought was pretty interesting. Next up, in addition to the early Blockout maps, left over in this chapter are also several test maps under a DesignGym umbrella. And first, we have DesignGym Main, which takes us to this main hub area where, as you can see, we have several doors here labeled with many different things. LDK Gallery, Demo, and Lane, with LDK here I presume standing for something like Level Design Kit, and Lane seems to be referring to Lane Price, who works as a level designer at Mob Entertainment. Then we also have navigation, pickups, interactions, narrative systems, metrics, and... Now, unfortunately, none of the doors here seems to work, nor do they have any teleporters. But off in the distance, there's also this box here, which the instructions over on the wall actually still work, as by pressing this key you can actually warp to this box. And here we can see a bunch of text overlaid on top of each other, which looks pretty funky. And if you warp here, it also seems to load in this massive section off in the distance, as before you do so, this section just doesn't seem to be there. But anyways, let's check it out. First up, we have a bunch of these tunnel sections here in a range of different heights and widths, nothing too crazy, but still kinda cool to walk through some of these. Then further up are several blockout buildings, again in a range of sizes from small, some with one window, bigger ones with two windows, bigger doors, bigger windows, some with square corners, some with angled corners, bigger buildings, and yeah, you get the picture. They're all empty though, as you can see, so there's not really much to them, but still pretty cool to check some of them out. At the end of these, towards the edge of the map, there's also a much larger building that itself contains several rooms inside of various types. And then the piece de resistance of this map is this more elaborate facility of sorts. Well, at least as elaborate as the blockout buildings get in this map. We got several different stair entrances, this spacious room with a drop-down hole in the middle. There's a narrow hallway with another drop-down hole at the end of it. There's this bit with, wow, yet another drop-down hole. I'm starting to see a pattern in this section. And then going up to like the 3rd floor here, there's a rather large room with another hallway that leads to either a staircase down to the ground floor or a balcony area outside. And then on the side of the building here, there's also a ramp that takes you all the way to the ground too. Now, I don't think this area is specifically an early version of anything in this series, as I don't recall any area having a layout similar to this one, so I guess the devs were just testing level design structure here, and although still basic, it was pretty fun to fart around in these different buildings here. Then next, let's go through all of the doors here from left to right, and unfortunately there doesn't seem to be anything left over for the first 2 destinations, so I guess we start with DesignGym LDK Lane, so presumably Lane Price worked on this one. Starting with this area, furthest away we have a tunnel section, and this might start feeling familiar to you if you've played Chapter 4, as this actually seems to be a blockout version of the sewer section that you go to after you exit Safe Haven there. So I thought that this was pretty neat to see here like this. Then going back to the main part of this map, first up we have building number 1 here, which has a nice little kitchen that uses some placeholder models of these chairs and table, and those should be lucky to get nicer models like that, as pretty much everything else throughout the house, like the fridge, stove, couch, TV, beds, and more, are all quite literally just blocks. Next, we got building number 2 here, which seems to be a little more detailed, and it even has 2 floors. And although this building has this nice dining room area here with some more chairs, the rest of the house is unfortunately even more empty than the previous building, as we don't even have the blocky placeholders here, and most of the rooms are just completely vacant. But despite that, with all of these windows in these rooms, they do have a sort of welcoming charm to them, and just look at that nice view. This building also has a ladder to what I assume is supposed to be an attic, but the geometry up here certainly isn't as nice as the lower floors, and like half of the roof is missing, so there's that too. Next up, off in the distance, is this platform with various objects on it, like some stairs, various little tests of what look to be the vents that you crawl through in this game, as well as this hollowed out cylinder. And then there's also a much larger cylinder beside it, with this object above it, which I can only assume fits perfectly around the cylinder below. Then lastly, for the buildings of this map, we have building 3 here, which is nice and spacious on the ground floor and has all of these support beams here. The upstairs section is fairly empty, but it also has another drop-down hole to take us back down. Now, I'm not really sure why there are all of these buildings being worked on here, as throughout the Poppy Playtime series, you don't really enter any homes like this. I guess there was the Home Sweet Home Orphanage, but that was a massive building and also way back in Chapter 3. So I doubt that these would have been tests for that. But who knows, maybe we'll eventually see homes like this in future chapters or something. And then last up for this level, there is this section labeled as Colors Showroom, and they weren't kidding, as after all of the basic gray tiles everywhere in this and the previous map, it was a breath of fresh air to actually see a bit of color here. So this room basically is a legend for what all of the different colors of objects mean in these blockout maps. We can see what the different door colors mean, with red being off or locked, so I guess that one door we found in the Dollhouse blockout was supposed to be locked. Red barrels were explosive, these green objects are vegetation. The little spikes here represent dirt or ground, we have these cave/rock objects. There are all of these cubes here just listed as other notables, though they aren't labeled what they are exactly. The blue floor here represents water, and lastly we have yellow stairs and a yellow window here, though again, it isn't labeled what the difference is supposed to be between the two, and there doesn't really seem to be any when interacting with them both. So yeah, your guess is as good as mine. Overall, a pretty slick little test map, and as cool as the buildings were, I think my favorite part here was seeing all of these blockout representations in this color showroom. Anyways, moving on, we have the navigation map, which is a rather massive one that essentially is a large playground for testing different movement things. From the starting area, we have a few possible choices: Grabpack travel or foot travel, which are hard to read as both have the teleporter text just behind them on the other side. as well as teleporting to a playground, which we'll save for last. Starting with the foot travel side, we have a jump distance test here, which, as it sounds, is a test of the gap distances a player can jump across. Going from the shortest gap that you can actually just walk across, gaps that you can jump at just walking speed, some that you have to sprint to jump across, and then lastly are 2 over 4 meters in distance that the player just can't jump across normally. Next, we have this section with these like stairs at different heights, with the one on the left being heights that you can just walk up normally from the ground without jumping until they get to be about 40 centimeters high. And then the right side here is similar, but now deals with jump heights up until the 100 centimeter one here. After this is this constricted sidle apparatus that, despite having so many slots, only 2 of them seem to have been worked on, as we have a default width as well as a default width to trigger the sidle function that's seen a few times in this chapter, though here it doesn't actually seem to work, so you just can't go through the gap. To the left of this, we got some text for contextual crawling, though there doesn't seem to be anything else here for that, so I guess this section just didn't end up getting developed for this map. Next is a beam width test, where we have beams ranging from a 1/4 meter in width up to 1.5 meters. Then near the middle is a test for crouching heights ranging from the lowest possible opening, which is apparently 1 meter, up to 1.5 meters, which is pretty roomy for crouching, but you still can't just walk normally through this. And then lastly, for the foot travel stuff, there's a ramp angles area here that kinda looks like a skate park, with a bunch of ramps at various angles ranging from a 15-degree angle up to 30 degrees. Then moving on to the Grabpack stuff, we start here with a climb handle section, and this seems to have been meant for testing how high the player could pull themselves up with a handle using the Grabpack. But the only problem is, there aren't any functioning handles here, and this is unfortunately something we'll see a lot of going forward. Next is a zipline test that looks like it could have been fun, but once again, this map no longer has the actual ziplines here that would take you across various distances with various height drops. And very similarly, there's also a test for swing handles, which I guess were meant to be attached to these floating blocks, but yet again, they ain't here, so unfortunately, not much really else to this one. And then last up for this area is a section for jump pads, I assume the purple Grabpack hand ones. And although you do get the purple hand for like 5 minutes in this chapter, you don't really get to use it at all, since there aren't any jump pads before you end up losing the Grabpack, and as a result, you can't really test the distance section here, nor the height bit back here. Now that I think about it, I guess this map might have been a leftover from Chapter 4, which did have jump pads and zip lines, neither of which I believe are seen in Chapter 5. So I guess since those aren't in this chapter, that explains why their corresponding objects aren't here. And then lastly for this map, we have the playground warp that we saw in the central room. And this takes us to another playground area of sorts, go figure, that probably would have been a lot more fun to play around in if the swing handles and jump pads were still here. But unfortunately, without those in this state, this room is just kinda meh. Next up, we have the Pickups map, which, as the name implies, is basically a gallery area for all of the chapter's pickups. In fact, it's one for this chapter as well as Chapter 4, which has its own dedicated section. Unfortunately, like the previous map, this one too appears to be left in a pretty gutted state, as although these pedestals all around the area are each labeled with a corresponding item, there's, well, no items here. And I assume that each of these was meant to actually have the item on top of it, or at least be interactable in some way. In any case, we got everything from Chapter 4's notes to VHS tapes, keycards, and more. Now what's kinda strange is that despite this being Chapter 5, the items in the Chapter 5 section of this map are all missing, even more than the others, as even all of the text in this section seems to be defaulting to just no item. And in comparison to the dozens of items on the Chapter 4 side, Chapter 5's only has like 8. Last for this map, there is a key items test area with several of these archways either listed as locked, keycard reader, or lever item. And I guess here is where functionality for certain items to open doors was tested. After this, we have the Interactions map, which loads into another hub-like area that goes to various other sections, dealing with a respective interactable like doors, buttons, and more. Now once again, this map is pretty gutted, leaving basically nothing interactable, which you could say is a problem with a map made for testing interactable objects. So yeah, there are a lot of areas in this map, but really not much noteworthy to share or do for this video, which really makes me wish that this was left over more complete in Chapter 4, which is what it looks like most of these were made for. Like, it would have been so cool to see like a full gallery of the cutouts here, or have a bunch of tests for levers and buttons and such, but outside of some dev text all around the area, which granted was pretty cool to see, the rest of the map is kinda unremarkable if you can't really do anything in most of the rooms, except for read about all of the objects that you're missing out on testing there. I guess one kind of interesting thing that we do have is this blockout yellow barrel here, which I believe I mentioned in a previous video. And from a distance, for a split second, I thought this was a giant limon at first glance. Anyways, yeah, lots of potential here with all of these different rooms, but it's just a shell of what it could be in this state. Next up, we have the metrics map, but it's even less intact as it only has the main hub room area. And then thankfully, last up for these DesignGym maps, we have the narrative one, which has a bunch for us to see. First, we drop down into another central hub area, which leads to various other sections. The non-playable cinematics room just has a platform for pivotal character moments, but whatever that was meant to be here is apparently missing. AI Companions doesn't actually have a warp at this point, but just has some dev text here saying that this would be a completely new system for PPC games. So essentially that this is a work in progress. I assume PP here stands for Poppy Playtime, but not really quite sure what the C would be. And with Chapter 5 seemingly regressing from AI-controlled enemies, it seems like we're getting further from AI companions, not closer to them. Then next we have playable set pieces, which is apparently stuff like chases or dreams and hallucinations, and this leads to a little test area for those dreams and hallucination ideas, which I guess aside from the stuff we saw back in Chapter 3, we haven't really seen since. And here, we can see some dev text better explaining the concept, as similar to the first part of Home Sweet Home back in Chapter 3, the idea is that the red smoke would cause the player to hallucinate various things that would be impossible in reality, and this would lead to various unique levels, mechanics, and characters. Now, my immediate comparison would actually be to Call of Duty Black Ops 7, which, although the campaign wasn't great, oddly enough, it did have basically the same concept, right down to the red smoke, which causes the characters in the game to experience crazy hallucinations, often having reality-defying sections. We unfortunately don't see much of that here at all, as this is basically just a little short chase segment of sorts, where a bridge section actually collapses, which is as interactable as we've seen these areas get for a while. And then there's also a chases hallway here too that unfortunately is just empty. After this is conditional storytelling, which includes stuff like branching narratives as well as item-gated and time-sensitive narratives, which if you watched my previous video, we discussed some dev-recorded dialogue left over in this chapter directly related to all of these. And with that in mind, you may not be surprised to hear that those dev recordings are actually implemented here, as in various sections, some press E to talk text will pop up, and if you do, you'll actually activate some of these dev lines.
Excuse me. Hey, so that jerk over there, he locked me in here, and I think I heard some critters rummaging around. I don't think it's really safe to be in here for too long. Could you get me out before it's too late?
Now, I had to crank the volume on them in my video, so here by default they're super quiet and incredibly difficult to hear. But anyways, this little hut is I guess the jail cell that the one NPC was trapped in for the time-sensitive quest. There's just an empty section here for the item-gated quest, and then behind the branching narrative section here is a pedestal for a Book of Secrets. That, I guess, was the diary item in question for the item-gated and branching narratives quests. And although neither the diary nor any of the NPCs seem to be here anymore, it's neat to actually get a bit more context for why those dev lines were recorded. Next up is emergent storytelling, which just leads to another bit of work in progress text, and after this is playable conversations, which includes interactive, walk and talk, as well as locked room conversations. And in this section, we have references to street performer characters that react to the player's presence, I suppose maybe similar to how some of the characters briefly react to you in Chapter 4's Safe Haven. There's a section for interactive conversations with a dev text blurb mentioning that this wasn't implemented in Chapter 4, and it mentions a hacked together proxy for this, and although there is another press E to talk dev text that pops up when you walk over here, it doesn't seem to do anything, unfortunately. And then lastly, there is a section for walk and talks, where I guess there was meant to be a test for this going up the stairs here, but there doesn't seem to be anything left of this either. And last up for this room is something I teased in my previous video, and it's for the Pika-Pal, which was referenced in one of the dev recordings for the Doctor. And based on this text here, this Pika-Pal would have functioned similar to the phone in Chapters 3 and 4, where characters could call you throughout the chapter. The text also describes it as being a character, potentially lighting up in special patterns, which I think very heavily suggests that this Pika-Pal idea was eventually reworked into Globy, and the scrapped walkie-talkie functions for Globy that are still referenced in some sound effects for it are remnants from this original phone call walkie-talkie functionality for the Pika-Pal. Now, Pika-Pal definitely sounds too similar to a certain yellow rodent, so at the very least, I think the name change was a good idea. Next, we have a test room for narrative pickups, which includes stuff like VHS tapes, audio logs, and lore notes. And here, we can see a pedestal for a lore note, which apparently wasn't functional at this point, since the inventory menu wasn't completed yet whenever this map was made. The VHS section is unfortunately empty too, and similarly, the section for the audio logs isn't complete either. But the dev text here reveals the idea for the cassette tapes to be playable via the Pika-Pal, just like you do with Globy in the final version of this chapter, so I think this basically confirms my theory from before. Next up is a room for remote audio, including stuff like phone calls, PA system announcements, and intercepted communications, I guess none of which are really heard in Chapter 5. Now this room is again pretty empty, but the dev text here refers to a seemingly scrapped idea for accessing security camera feeds, which sounds like a pretty cool idea, and if I recall correctly, I think this was something that was being tested around when Project Playtime first launched. And then what I think is the weirdest part of this map is that for the phone calls section here, we straight up have like screenshots of one of the developer's Unreal Engine windows, as well as a screenshot of working on Chapter 4, as we can see the train yard section you get to near the start of the chapter. And I guess based on the dev text here, these were slapped in as an example for setting up trigger points for a phone call. But yeah, this was just really strange to see, and I had to do like a double take when I first saw this from a distance. Next is the environmental storytelling room, and although most of the interactable objects are missing, yeah, big shocker at this point, we still have some pedestals for two different keycards. Keycard A, which unlocks a green door, or Keycard B, which has traces of blood suggesting more danger but also invokes more curiosity for the player to explore what someone bled for. I guess this was a simple test for different items having different text descriptions. Then lastly here, we have a prop-based micro-stories test, where here, we can actually see the blockout pressure plate models I covered in my previous videos, and stepping on these doesn't really seem to do anything, unfortunately. And then finally, between the two pressure plates here is also this guy, which is another placeholder model I covered in my previous videos. And here we can see him with a Grabpack and soaking in a pool of red Kool-Aid. I guess testing something like seeing a dead employee as environment art in the game. Now at first I thought maybe these switches here were related to this fella dying or something, but this guy is already like this when you first enter this area. Then we also have a miscellaneous hallway which didn't get finished and just has some TBD text. And then finally we have one more area, this time dedicated to the Pika-Pal, and there's nothing really here besides some more dev text. We got the same blurb here that we saw previously in that other room, as well as this new one for moment-to-moment gameplay discussing that the Pika-Pal hadn't been designed yet, and some ideas for it included scripted dialogue as well as unique lantern-like capabilities that could adapt to be a form of character expression. Yep, I think we definitely got that in Chapter 5 here. Overall, although this area was again, for the most part, pretty gutted, it did have at least a few interesting areas to check out. And it was fun to see some more player test areas as well as see some more insight into the pre-Globy Pika-Pal. Now for the next map, we have DesignGym Hook Hand, and as I covered in previous videos, it looks like before it was changed to the EMU Cuffs. The idea to zip around in this chapter was yet another hand, the hook hand. And here, the hook hand is just represented by a red hand as a placeholder, and we also have a placeholder object nearby that's hookable, I guess meant as a test for the hook hand's functionality. Then similarly, there's also a test map for the pressure hand that just has the pressure hand itself like oddly doubled over the green hand here. And there are supposed to be some pushable boxes to test here, but since there's no floor in this map, at least at this point, upon loading in, the boxes just drop off into the void below. And this is where things get a bit interesting. Sorry for the big voice change up here. Turns out recording a nearly 1 hour video in one day is a bad idea, so it really messed up my voice, and I'm recording this after the video was basically finished. Anyways, I was just revisiting the main DesignGym map from before, and upon enabling the debug view, I saw a hitbox off in the distance, and upon getting close to it, it actually instantly loaded in this room that seems to be a complete version of the pressure, hook, and conductive hands. And after pressing the button to load in the test area we checked out earlier, there now is a floor for the pushable boxes, so we can test out hooking onto this box as well as pushing these boxes around. Now the boxes are very touchy, like you can only push them slightly, otherwise they will just get deleted out of existence, as I guess they get pushed way too fast or something. I was also able to just grab the Grabpack hands, which was honestly just so funny. I think the joke just writes itself here. And if one little hand grabbing a comically large one wasn't enough, I was actually able to do this with both hands too. Like, bruh, this is wild. And then after I dropped the hands, they would just like flip around in the air, and honestly this felt like my game was possessed. Like, what the hell is going on here? Weird shenanigans aside, I'm glad I revisited this area and found this. It was kinda cool to test the Grabpack hands here, even if the pushable boxes would blow up if you sneezed at them. Anyways, back to the regular voice. Now that's about all for the DesignGym maps, but even after those, we still have a few more maps to go, and next up we have a Blockout Kit map, which as you can see contains a whole collection of blockout objects. We got vent segments, ladders, ramps, stairs, columns, walls, arches, you name it, it's probably here, and in multiple sizes to boot. It's pretty neat to see all of these objects together in a room like this, and extra cool to have them all labeled with what they are, and even their dimensions too. After this is a map titled Collectibles Actor Palette, and finally we have a functional item gallery of sorts with the items actually present. Now, although you can't pick up these notes or interact with them in any way, they're all actually here, just how they're seen in-game, and we have everything from the lore notes to the various different music puzzle ones, the regeneration formula presentation slides, and then as a bonus I guess, even some Globy fan art here as well. Now this is definitely what I was expecting to see in the other test maps, and although we didn't get it there, at least we get a small sample of it in this one. And then last up, we have two similar unused maps, PSO Cacher as well as PSO Main. Now for both of these, you seem to load into the same area, which is mostly empty with several little chunks around the area with different objects which we'll get to soon. Now in both maps, you spawn onto this little white platform, and in the Cacher map, you kinda just keep respawning there every few seconds. And then in the main map, you actually get taken to the start of the chapter, well, technically at least. Although the player instance itself seems to still be on that same white platform, over time, different parts of the game will load in the distance, but only for a few seconds until it then deloads again. And oftentimes, if it's a cutscene, your camera will get taken there too. I'm sure there's gotta be a good reason for the map doing all this, so if you're a dev that's worked with Unreal Engine that may know, let us know down in the comments. In any case though, I was curious, so I decided to load all of the map in at once, which proved to be a bad idea, as in addition to having everything loading in at the same time being incredibly taxing on my PC, I guess it also loaded in all of the cutscenes at the same time. So I would get bounced from the intro cutscene to the dollhouse section to getting spat out by Chum, and then finally I'd get to the tea party, and this is unedited footage. In addition to it being super choppy, a bunch of the subtitles would compete for which one would be shown on screen, and then ultimately the game just decided nope, no more, and froze up. I was still curious, however, so I decided loading everything in again, but this time I paused the game, which thankfully didn't pause stuff from loading in. Now normally, each level is segmented and loaded between separately, always using either a transition like Chum gobbling you up or a hard loading screen. So having everything loaded together like this is pretty much otherwise impossible. And honestly, it was really cool to see the entire game loaded like this and just see how most areas are connected despite the load points between them. Some areas like Sweet Street seem to overlap with some other parts of the game, and seeing the background textures everywhere was kinda surreal in some areas. And then finally, getting to all of the objects we saw earlier, by pausing the game before the other parts of the map start rolling in, we can see various models around the area, including a Grabpack, the Omni, Blue, and Flare Gun hands. There's a T-posing model of the old Grabpack you find in Bronze Mouth. All of the wrong side Audimal models are here in all of their colors that are seen. There's a model of Globy, the shapes from the first Huggy memory sequence. Oddly enough, clean models of all of these smiling critters are here, despite I don't think ever being seen in the chapter like this. And then in addition to all of those, lastly are various different sections with a bunch of cubes like this, each showcasing either a texture, visual effect, or other objects. These include unused textures like the ones left over from the Project Playtime Claw game, various fire effects, some for the hand scanners, shattered glass, smoke, this one that gets brighter and darker, there's this glowing blue cube that reminds me of Scott Cawthon's self-insert character. There's a section that appears to feature all of the models and textures for the various items that you find in this chapter, including the Audimal toys, notes, VHS tapes, as well as the golden statues, with some of the folders here oddly rocking the default Unreal textures. We got more flame-like effects, textures of the balloons seen in this chapter, shines, this thing that distorts your view akin to something like ice. This cube rocks a texture for stuff like computers and warning labels. One has a waterfall effect, and much, much, much more. And in addition to all of those, there are also cubes for Poppy Gel, a lot of them. I kid you not, there are 3 or 4 different sections that have cubes like this in an assortment of types. Some still, some undulating, some glowing, some moving, some bright, some dark, you get the picture. I get that the Poppy Gel is pretty central to the theme of this chapter, but I just thought it was funny to see so many of these here. Closer to this large white platform, there's also a conductive hand, crumpets both fresh and moldy, yum. We got a light blue block, some lights, as well as another Poppy Gel cube. I still have no clue why any of these objects are where they are in this map. I guess maybe their placement would make more sense in the context of everything being loaded in, but in any case, I think it was really cool to see all of this here, especially some of the more interesting visual effects. Now, there are a few more maps that you can load into, but they're all either empty or just have a single object, such as this train VFX map just has whatever this object is, as well as a bunch of Poppy Gel globs here. So I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more, and I will see you in a bit.